Return to the great powers, Russia, China, and the next World War. What are we talking? Is this going to be a Cold War, a hot war?
It's an uplifting story, you know, something
yeah, I was going to say,
on a Sunday afternoon.
It's a lovely read that I read to my kid, just to scare him to do better in school, to be honest.
It's a warning, right? And I've spent a lot of years in these places tracking these things, which I think we have to be concerned about. Mm-hmm. So it's meant to be a warning, and I think it's a serious one. But I also think going into it, that is the people who want a world not run by autocrats, right? And not
which invaded, is about half of us,
which is, yeah, more, maybe even more. We have some advantages going into it, right? So I direct over time to ways that we could find a way forward, right? Avoid the next World War, but also come out on top with the things that we hold valuable.
It provides in some ways a blueprint to get past that, but also looks back as to how we've gotten where we are right now. You're focusing a lot about where we are in this moment with Ukraine, yes. Talk about where we are with China. You call this a post-Cold War moment. How do you draw that line from the Cold War to the post-Cold War?
So, you know, for my generation, and you're younger than me, but still.
20s, max.
We remember that moment. We remember that night, fall of the wall, 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Soviet Union. This was, we thought, bringing about a period of peace, and it did for a time, right? I mean, the Cold War was over, and for a very brief moment in time, the U.S. and Russia, if not friends, found a way to go forward. And with China, even as it was growing more powerful, we thought that Russia and China, that we could work with them all the time. I mean, there's still ways we could work with them, but we thought that they wanted what we wanted, right? We were mirroring to some extent. And the truth is, they don't really want what we want to a large degree, because they see it, and to be fair, they're seeing this from a different perspective. They see our world order as being to our advantage and not theirs. So they see it as in their interests to make America weaker and to undermine that system. Now, to be clear, when I talk to folks, in Europe, in Asia, here in the U.S., they don't believe that China and Russia want to go to war with us, right? They're smart enough people to know that that would be a horrible war to be a hot one. That said, they're willing to push the limits pretty far. I mean, and one that we saw just in the last few years, right, is the largest invasion, the largest land war in Europe in 80 years, right? I mean, that's a pretty big deal. And that shows how far they're willing to push the limits.
Well, you wrote this book, obviously, before the terrorist attacks in Russia just a week ago. I'm wondering how you see an attack like that affecting some of these pathways.
Well, listen, post 9/11, that was a period when the U.S. and Russia actually worked together on terror. They were sharing information and so on. And it showed that there are times that you have shared interests, and that's a good thing. And there are other things, too. The U.S. and China actually at times work together on climate change. That's not a bad thing. But a whole host of things that we don't work together on or like at loggerheads on. That period with Russia has certainly ended to the point where the reporting is that the U.S. actually warned Russia that an attack like this was in the offing, and Putin basically ignored that warning. You know, that's partly a lack of trust, which is important. It's partly a lack of communication, that those channels just aren't open anymore. So that's a sign of one of the dangerous trends here, is that we don't talk in ways that we used to. And I'm not necessarily talking about happy talk, right? But we don't have hotlines open that we used to, which are important to keep small things from becoming bigger things. And those hotlines developed because in the last Cold War, we got really damn close, right? I mean, if you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? I mean, that was very, and I talk about this in the book because it's about learning lessons from history as well, but that came close to a global nuclear war. And after that, folks like Kennedy and Khrushchev said, we got to find ways that doesn't happen. We don't get that close here. Let's have hotlines. Let's negotiate some nuclear treaties, et cetera. And the thing is, we have to get back to that point, because right now we're going this way. We're not going this way.
I mean, it's interesting. You do talk a lot about that. You have to keep these lines of communication open. And you also have a chapter, or you look at this madman theory. Donald Trump brags about the relationship that he has with Vladimir Putin. He brags about what he did with Kim Jong-un. And I think, on one hand, you can see through what that means and what he wants from that. On the other hand, he's talking about legitimate connections. You actually even talk about some of the successes Trump had with his relationship with Kim Jong-un. And this madman theory, in some sense, of being so big, so braggadocio, that tactically, that sometimes can be beneficial in ways that other tactics can't.
True. Well, listen, opening channels is not a bad thing, right? You know, sitting down with Kim Jong-un is not a bad thing, or with Putin or Xi. We have to be talking. That's better than not talking, because when you don't talk, I mean, that's true in relationships as well, right? When you don't
Jim,
talk,
stay focused.
Small things.
Jim, we got to stay focused. You're here to talk about the book, Jim. Talk about the Cold War and the next war, all right?
You got to talk. Talking is not bad, but you also have to have realistic expectations. So Trump had 3 face-to-face meetings with Kim Jong-un. Went nowhere, right? There were no agreements. But sheer force of personality is not going to change their long-term interests. The worrisome thing, right, is that for Russia and China, these are strategic decisions to undermine the U.S. and the system as it stands today. Again, because they look at it as aligned against them, kind of skewed against them. So the strongest personality in the world is not going to change long-term strategic interests, right? And if Trump imagines, as he does, and by the way, don't trust me, I talked to folks who advised him at the most senior levels in his last administration. If Trump believes by his personality alone, he's going to fundamentally change that dynamic, it just doesn't line up with reality, right? Doesn't mean talking is a bad idea, but you have to know who you're dealing with here, and you have to know what they're seeking to do, and you have to be clear to say, I'm not going to let that happen.
Yeah. You talked to a lot of Trump insiders here. I think something that stood out in reading this was we'd heard stories about Trump's desire to pull out of NATO. And I think you kind of walked through how close that was to becoming a reality. And what I find compelling, like, that's a big issue right now. And I will say when I go out and I talk to people at MAGA events, you know, there's an isolationist attitude, to say the least. But I do think a lot of people don't. When you bring up something like NATO, the idea of pulling out of NATO is a no-brainer. We want to be to ourselves. It doesn't serve us it doesn't do us any good. And I will also say, as a younger generation, as somebody who's 24, as you pointed out, like the conversation in my school about the Cold War was short. Our understanding of NATO, we don't have. We are so disconnected from the realities of what that was created for that I think like the discussions we're having right now about the importance of NATO are falling on deaf ears on one party and one candidate, but also on deaf ears on, I think, an electorate that isn't educated in history in a way to understand what NATO is supposed to do. Is this also a crisis of education?
100%. I mean, you know as well as me that the baseball bat doesn't work, right? When you're trying to convince people of the importance of these things or how it's served our interests over time. You have to just remind people and make an argument as to what we gain from it. I mean, I think when you look at a place like Ukraine, so Ukraine is a country of 40 million. It's the largest country in Europe. I've spent a lot of time there. They're lovely people, right? They don't want much more than what we have, which is to be able to choose your own leaders, travel where you want to go, and not get dumped off of building balconies, right? If you write a critical piece about the person in charge of the country, I might be speaking about how Russia, you know, what life is like in Russia today. Sure. That's the way it is. They don't want that. They don't want to live under that. So you have a sympathetic case as to why to help these people or why to help the Taiwanese people defend themselves from China. But then you have a self-interested case, which is that, you know, NATO has stood by the U.S. The only time NATO has invoked its mutual defense agreement was post 9/11, and they went to war with us in Afghanistan post 9/11. So you have that. But also a peaceful Europe that is free from Russian domination is in our interests. It's a vibrant Europe. It's an economically healthy Europe. We sell a lot of stuff there. We could go do business there. We could send our kids to semesters abroad there, that kind of thing. Things we buy are cheaper here because it's peaceful there. And you could say the same thing about Asia. You know, half the stuff in our homes comes through shipping lanes in Asia, which the U.S. helps keep open. So you have both a sympathetic case to make for this kind of thing and a values case, but you also have a self-interested case because we benefited from that for years, and not just since the last Cold War, but even going back to like 80 years ago, post-World War II, that NATO and other treaties helped keep the peace pretty much. It's not perfect, but they did prevent so far, right, you know, the next World War. And that's important. We benefit from that.
You talked about this not just being a downer. But there is a blueprint for some optimism there. Where do you see that?
So a couple things. One, like, we don't want to look at them as 10 feet tall, Russia or China. They make mistakes, right? I mean, prior to the Ukraine invasion, you probably heard this too. A lot of folks were like, Putin's way too smart to do that. He's playing three-dimensional chess with the West, all that kind of stuff. He would never do it. Lo and behold, he invades.
I also think nobody knows how chess works.
Exactly.
The way people use that metaphor, it's like, we don't really have a good understanding of that.
To be clear, my 8-year-old daughter beats me at chess. So I'm with you.
Stay focused, Jim. Stay focused.
So, you know, they make mistakes too, and he got himself in a horrible war, which, you know, he's effectively losing, right? And China makes mistakes as well, and its economy is, you know, it's definitely flattening out. This idea that China is going to be growing forever. They've got weaknesses as well. So you want to start with, we have advantages. The U.S. economy is growing. You know, we have an open society. People buy and want to buy American stuff, right? They don't want to buy Russian cell phones, right? You know, there's a reason for that, right?
I haven't tried one. I'd try one out.
They might blow up. So we have advantages in that sense. We have a lot of friends and allies. One thing when you look at Russia and China, they don't have allies. I mean, Russia's biggest allies right now are China, North Korea, and Iran. I mean, we have all of Europe, in effect, on our side with shared values. So we have advantages going in. And then in terms of how to find a path so that we don't go to war, I mean, people ask me this, they're like, well, sounds like you're making the case to go to war against Russia and China. And I always say to them, I said this before we came on, I've got a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old boy. They're like a minute away from draft age. And I'm sure folks in the audience who have kids think the same thing. You don't want them on a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Taiwan Strait if the U.S. and China were to go to war. I don't want that either. But we can learn from history here, right? One thing is communication lines matter. There's a reason why Kennedy and Khrushchev were like, we got really close. I got to have a phone on my desk. You got to have a phone on your desk so this doesn't happen again. Those things have faded over time. And with China, in a lot of respects, we haven't had them. They've come and gone when relationships have gone up and down. So communication matters. Treaties matter. You know, we negotiated those nuclear arms treaties, again, to keep the U.S. and Russia from going to war and kind of like just beating each other to death in a nuclear arms race. A lot of those treaties have gone away in the last several years. And there are Americans who are like, we don't need those treaties. Well, actually, they kind of help, right? And we have no treaties with China when it comes to nuclear weapons. There are no treaties regarding cyber weapons. There are no treaties regarding weapons in space. I mean, Russia just, probably saw our story a few weeks ago, talked about putting a nuke in space to knock out satellites, which, by the way, just so you know, if you think about this war being a million miles away from us, with cyber attacks or with attacks in space, we lose all the technology we depend on every day. GPS and communications and internet and the financial market stop. So, this stuff affects us at home. We need treaties for that stuff.
We were heading to the good news, and you just mentioned a nuclear weapon in space.
This is why my kids love talking to their dads so much, right? This is what I bring home. But the final thing is that you can, with those treaties, they can help. They can help this going down a bad path. And the final thing is that communicating what you won't stand for matters, right? I mean, if you look, I speak a lot to the Estonian prime minister here. Estonia is like right on the front lines of this, right next to Russia. And she constantly quoted Churchill about Hitler, which is an appeaser is the one who feeds the crocodile expecting that he'll be its last meal. The thing is, the parallels between a Hitler and a Putin is that if you give a little ground, he tends to take more. He took a piece of Georgia in 2008, then he took Ukraine in 2014, then he invaded again. That clear communication, and we learned this from Hitler, if you are soft and don't tell them what's too far for you, they might then take advantage and move forward. So the U.S., I think, and its allies can be confident and say, we're not going to allow you to invade countries because borders matter to us and they're our friends and we're going to stand in the way and the costs are going to be high for you. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take you to war by any means, but that we defend our friends and we're going to be strong. And those messages matter over time. And if you look back, sometimes clear messaging can prevent miscalculation and can prevent the guy on the other side thinking he could take advantage of you.
Well, it's a great read. The Return of Great Powers, available now. Be sure to check out CNN Newsroom on Max. Jim Sciutto.